Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
I got the assignment on a Tuesday morning. That's when everything started, really. Tony Butler called me into his office at the ranger station around 9:30, and I could tell from his face it wasn't going to be routine paperwork. "Ford, sit down," he said, not looking up from the stack of reports on his desk. Tony's got this way of talking that makes everything sound official, even when he's just asking if you want coffee. 22 years in the service will do that to you, I guess. I sat in the metal chair across from his desk. The office smelled like old coffee and the pine air freshener that hung from his desk lamp. Same smell every day for the past 3 years I'd worked under him. "We've got a problem up at Blackwood," Tony said, finally meeting my eyes. 3 hikers, all experienced, all missing. That got my attention. Blackwood was the old logging camp about 15 miles north of the station. Nobody went up there much anymore since they shut down the operation in the 90s. The trails were still open to the public, but they were rough, not the kind of place casual hikers usually ended up. "When?" I asked. "Past month. Different times, different groups. First was a solo hiker, guy named Marcus Chen, 34, been hiking these mountains for years. His car was still in the parking area when we found it 3 days later." Tony pulled out a manila folder and flipped it open. I could see photos clipped to the inside, headshots, probably from driver's licenses. Second was a couple from Portland, Sarah and Jim Hendricks. They'd registered for a 2-day backcountry permit, never checked out. We found their campsite exactly where they'd marked on their permit form. Tent was still up, food still in their packs. No signs of struggle, no signs they'd ever left the area. He flipped to another page. Third was just last week, group of 4 college kids from Oregon State. They knew what they were doing, all members of their outdoor club, all had wilderness experience. Same story, cars in the lot, no trace of the hikers. I leaned back in the chair. 7 people total. That wasn't normal, not even for terrain like Blackwood. "Search and rescue?" I asked. "Extensive. We've had teams up there for a combined total of 18 days over the past month. Dogs. Helicopter overflights. Ground crews. Nothing. Not a piece of clothing. Not a footprint off the established trails. It's like they just vanished." Tony closed the folder and set it on top of the other papers. "I need you to go up there and document everything. Every trail marker, every campsite, every access point. Take photos, GPS coordinates, detailed notes. We're looking at closing those trails to public access, and I need a complete report before that happens." I nodded. Made sense. If people were disappearing up there, the smart move was to keep more people from going up there until we figured out what was happening. Could be environmental, unstable ground, unmarked hazards, something we'd missed in previous surveys. Could be wildlife, though that didn't explain the complete lack of remains or evidence. Could be something else entirely. "When do you need this done?" I asked. "Soon as possible." Park Service is breathing down my neck about liability. If we can't explain what happened to these people, they want those trails closed by next week. I thought about my schedule. I had some routine maintenance checks planned for the next couple days, but nothing that couldn't wait. "I can head up Thursday morning," I said. "Give me Wednesday to prep and review the search reports." "Good. Take your time up there, Ford. I want every detail. This isn't just about closing trails. 7 missing people deserves answers." He was right about that. I'd been doing this job for 3 years, and before that I'd worked search and rescue in Colorado for 5 years. People don't just disappear without leaving some kind of trace. There's always something. Torn fabric on a branch, disturbed ground, equipment left behind. Always. I'll get you those answers, I said. Tony nodded and picked up another folder from his desk. That was my cue to leave. I stood up and headed for the door. "Ford," he called when I was halfway out. "Be careful up there." I spent Wednesday going through the search reports. Every team that had gone up to Blackwood had followed standard procedures. They'd covered the main trails, the secondary paths, even pushed into some off-trail areas where someone might have gotten lost or disoriented. The dog teams had picked up scents at the trailheads and campsites, but those scents didn't lead anywhere. Just stopped, like the people had been lifted straight up into the air. That part bugged me a little. Thursday morning, I loaded my state truck with survey equipment, camera gear, and enough supplies for a full day in the field. The drive up to Blackwood took about an hour on winding forest roads that got narrower and rougher the further you went from the main highway. I'd been up there before, but not for almost 2 years. The last time was for a routine trail maintenance inspection, and even then the area had felt pretty isolated. Now, with everything that had happened, it felt downright remote. The road ended at a rusted metal gate that blocked vehicle access to the actual camp. There was a small parking area, really just a widened spot where the road stopped, and I could see tire tracks in the dirt from the search team's vehicles. I parked the truck and grabbed my pack from the bed. The gate had been locked with a heavy chain, but the search teams had cut through it. Now it hung open, the severed links still attached to the posts. I walked through and started following what used to be the main road into the logging camp. 40 minutes. That's what the trail guide said. 40 minutes of hiking to reach the old Blackwood site. The road had been paved once, probably back in the 70s or 80s when the logging operation was running full steam. Now it was mostly broken asphalt and gravel, with weeds growing up through the cracks and small trees sprouting along the edges. The forest pressed in close on both sides. Dense pine forest, the kind that blocks out most of the sunlight even on bright days like this one. I could hear birds somewhere up in the canopy, but I couldn't see them. Just shadows and the sound of my boots on the deteriorating road surface. After about 10 minutes of walking, the road surface gave way completely to dirt and gravel. Then even that started to fade, until I was following what was basically just a path through the trees. You could still tell it had been a road once. The corridor was too straight and too wide to be a natural trail, but nature was definitely reclaiming it. I kept walking, checking my GPS every few minutes and taking photos of trail markers and anything else that seemed relevant. The path wound gradually uphill, following the natural contours of the mountainside. It was quiet up there. Really quiet. Not the normal kind of forest quiet where you can still hear wind in the trees and insects buzzing around. This was different, like the whole place was holding its breath. I figured it was probably just my imagination. Knowing that 7 people had disappeared somewhere up ahead was bound to make everything feel a little more ominous than it actually was. Still, I made a mental note to include that observation in my report. Sometimes the subjective stuff matters as much as the hard data. The path kept winding uphill through the pines, and I kept following it deeper into the forest. The path opened up after about 40 minutes of walking. That was it. I could see the camp. Honestly, it looked exactly like the old forestry photos I'd studied. 3 weathered bunkhouses lined up in a row, their roofs sagging but still intact. A larger mess hall sat at the far end, and there was this smaller building off to the side that had to be the foreman's office. The whole thing was maybe the size of a city block, tucked into this natural clearing where the trees had been cut back in the 80s. I stopped at the edge and just took it in for a minute. The place felt frozen, like someone had walked away yesterday and forgot to come back. The forest was trying to claim it all back, though. Vines wrapped around the bunkhouse porches. Moss covered most of the roofs. Small trees had sprouted right up against the foundations, and in some spots I could see they'd actually pushed through the wooden siding. Nature doesn't mess around when people leave. I pulled out my camera and started with the wide shots. Standard documentation stuff. The camp from multiple angles, showing the layout and general condition. My GPS read the coordinates as exactly what the forestry records indicated. Everything matched. The largest bunkhouse sat closest to where I'd entered the clearing. It made sense to start there. The building was maybe 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, raised on concrete blocks about 2 feet off the ground, standard logging camp construction from that era. The exterior walls were rough-cut lumber that had weathered to this gray color, and the metal roof had rust stains running down from every seam. I walked around the whole structure first, taking photos from each corner. That's protocol. Document everything before you go inside and potentially disturb anything. The windows were all intact, which surprised me a little. Usually vandals or weather would have taken out the glass by now. But these were small panes, maybe 12 inches square, set high up near the roof line. The front door was unlocked, just a simple wooden door with a basic handle. No deadbolt or anything fancy. I guess security wasn't a big concern out here back in the day. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old wood and dust, but not the musty rot smell you'd expect, more like a workshop that hadn't been used in a while. The interior was one long room with wooden bunk beds lined up along both walls. Maybe 20 beds total. Each bunk had a thin mattress that looked surprisingly well preserved. I started photographing everything methodically, wide shots first, then details, the bunks, the windows, the single wood-burning stove at the far end. There were still personal items scattered around, coffee mugs on a shelf, a deck of cards on one of the beds, work boots under another bunk. That's when I noticed something felt off. I'm not great at estimating distances, but I'd walked around the outside of this building. It was definitely about 60 feet long. But standing inside, looking from the front door to the back wall, it felt shorter, like maybe 45 feet. I figured it was just perspective. Buildings always look different from inside. But the feeling bugged me a little. I pulled out my measuring tape, standard 25-footer that I keep in my pack for survey work. I measured from the inside of the front wall to the inside of the back wall, stretching the tape down the center aisle between the bunks. 42 feet, 6 inches. That couldn't be right. I measured again, being more careful this time. Same result. I went back outside and measured the exterior length. 58 feet, 4 inches from corner to corner. The math didn't work. Even accounting for wall thickness, I was missing about 12 feet somewhere. I walked around the building again, looking for anything I might have missed. Maybe an addition or extension that I hadn't noticed. But no, it was just a simple, rectangular structure. Nothing complicated about it. Back inside, I started examining the back wall more carefully. It was the same rough lumber as the rest of the interior, with the same weathering and dust patterns. But now that I was looking for it, something seemed different about the spacing. The bunks along the back wall were positioned closer to the wall than the others. Not by much, maybe 18 inches instead of 3 feet. But enough that you'd notice if you were paying attention. I walked up to the back wall and knocked on it. Solid wood, like the rest of the building. But when I knocked on the section between two of the support posts, it sounded different. Hollower. That got my attention. I started pressing against the wall, running my hands along the boards. Most of them were solid, nailed tight to the frame. But there was this one section, about 4 feet wide, where the board seemed to give a little when I pushed. I found the seam. It was hidden pretty well, disguised to look like the natural gap between boards. But when I got my fingers into it and pulled, a whole section of the wall swung inward like a door. Behind it was empty space, just darkness. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it through the opening. It was another room, maybe 12 feet deep and the full width of the building. Completely empty except for dust and some old equipment I couldn't make out from the doorway. This explained the missing footage. There was a hidden room taking up the back section of the building. I stepped through the opening and looked around. The space was set up like a workshop or storage area. Workbenches along the walls, tool racks that were mostly empty now, a few wooden crates stacked in one corner. The air smelled different in here, less dusty, more like metal and oil. But here's what really got me thinking. The hidden door was well made, not some quick addition or afterthought. The hinges were proper hardware, and the whole mechanism was designed to be concealed from the main room. Someone had planned this space carefully. I started photographing everything, but my mind was racing. Why would a logging camp need a hidden room? What were they storing back here that couldn't go in the regular storage buildings? I examined the crates in the corner. They were empty now, but I could see stenciled markings on the sides, partial words that were too faded to read completely. Something that started with XPL, and another that looked like it might say, danger. The workbenches had bolts and mounting holes where heavy equipment had been attached. Whatever they'd been doing in here required serious hardware. I kept taking photos and making notes, but I was starting to realize this whole assignment was about to get a lot more complicated. I'd come here to document trail markers and campsites for a simple closure report. Instead, I'd found evidence that Blackwood wasn't just a standard logging operation. And if there were secrets buried in this camp's history, maybe that had something to do with why 7 people had disappeared without a trace. I finished photographing the hidden room and stepped back into the main bunkhouse. The discovery changed everything about how I was looking at this place. What had seemed like a routine documentation job was turning into something much bigger. I had a feeling I was going to be spending a lot more time at Blackwood than I'd originally planned. I was about to head back to the hidden room when something caught my eye. The floorboards in the back corner didn't line up right. I mean, they looked fine at first glance, but when you spend enough time in old buildings like I do, you notice when things are off. These boards sat a little higher than the rest, just a fraction of an inch, but enough. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the seam. The wood felt different, too. Less weathered. Like maybe someone had pulled these boards up before and put them back down. Not recently, but not original either. Well, shit, I said to the empty bunkhouse. My voice sounded weird in there, too loud. I figured I should check it out. That's the job, right? Document everything. And this definitely counted as everything. I pulled my multi-tool from my belt and worked the knife blade under the edge of one board. It came up easier than it should have. Way easier. The second board lifted right out once I got my fingers under it. Someone had definitely been here before. The nail holes were too clean, the wood edges too smooth. This wasn't decades of natural settling. This was access. I pried up 3 more boards and stacked them to the side. That gave me a hole about 2 feet by 3 feet, big enough to see down into whatever was underneath. The smell hit me first, musty and old, but not just wood rot. Something else. Like a basement that's been closed up too long. I pulled my flashlight from my pack and clicked it on. Holy hell. The beam cut through the darkness and lit up what looked like a yard sale that had been buried in dust for 50 years. Personal stuff. Lots of it. Way more than should be under the floor of an old logging camp. I lay flat on my stomach and angled the light around the crawl space. It was bigger than I expected. Maybe 6 feet deep and stretched under a good portion of the back corner. And it was packed. Wallets scattered around like someone had dumped a box. Work boots lined up along one side. Watches, wedding rings, a bunch of other stuff I couldn't make out from up here. This wasn't right. Not even close to right. I mean, you'd expect some personal items left behind when a logging operation shuts down. Guys forget things, leave stuff they don't want to carry. But this looked like a collection, like someone had been gathering this stuff on purpose. My hands were shaking a little when I lowered myself partway into the hole, just enough to reach the nearest items. I didn't want to disturb everything by climbing down there, but I needed to see what I was looking at. The first thing I grabbed was a brown leather wallet, cracked and faded, but still in one piece. I opened it up and found a driver's license behind a yellowed plastic window. Oregon State License. Expired in 1965. The photo showed a guy with dark hair and a mustache, maybe 40 years old. Name was Robert Kellerman. I'd never heard that name before. And I'd spent yesterday going through every crew roster I could find for Blackwood. Every employment record, every safety report. Robert Kellerman wasn't on any of them. I reached for another wallet. This one was black, smaller. The license inside belonged to James Cordell. Expired 1964. Different face, different name, but same deal. No record of him working at Blackwood that I'd seen. That's when it hit me that I needed to be more systematic about this. If I was going to document everything properly, I had to do it right. I couldn't just grab stuff randomly and hope to make sense of it later. I climbed back out of the hole and got my camera. Took photos of the opening from multiple angles, showing how the floorboards had been modified. Then I set up my LED lantern to give me better light and started working through the items one by one. I found 13 wallets total. Every single one had identification from the 1960s. Robert Kellerman, James Cordell, Thomas Wright, Michael Santos, David Park. Names I'd never seen on any Blackwood paperwork. Faces I'd never seen in any company photos. The watches were the same story. Personal engravings on some of them. Happy Anniversary, Love Mary on one. To Dad from the Kids on another. These weren't work items. These were things people carried because they mattered. The wedding rings really got to me. 7 of them, different styles, different sizes. One was engraved with Forever Susan on the inside band. Another had a date, June 15th, 1958. These weren't things you just forgot and left behind. You don't accidentally lose your wedding ring at a logging camp. You don't abandon your wallet with all your identification. This was personal stuff that people would have noticed was missing right away. I found work boots, too. 12 pairs. All different sizes, all different brands. Some were barely worn, others were beat to hell. But they were all good boots, expensive boots, not the kind of thing you'd throw away or forget about. By the time I'd documented everything, I had identification for 19 different men, 19 names that appeared nowhere in the official records, 19 people who supposedly had never worked at Blackwood, but whose most important personal belongings were buried under the floorboards of a bunkhouse. The dates on the IDs ranged from 1963 to 1967, right in the middle of Blackwood's operational period. These guys should have been on the crew rosters. Their names should have been in the employment files, but they weren't. That's what really disturbed me. Not just that there were so many personal items, but that the people who owned them seemed to have been erased from the official record, like they'd never existed. I sat back on my heels and looked at all the stuff laid out on the floor around me. Wallets, watches, rings, boots. Each one representing someone who'd been here. Someone who'd left behind things they never would have left behind voluntarily. The silence in the bunkhouse felt different now. Heavier. Like the building itself was holding its breath. I'd come here to document trail markers and campsite locations. Take some photos, make some notes, help the Park Service figure out if they needed to close the area. Standard stuff, routine work. But this wasn't routine anymore. This was something else entirely, something that connected to those 7 missing hikers in a way I couldn't figure out yet, but definitely couldn't ignore. I needed to photograph every single item, get serial numbers off the watches, copy down all the information from the licenses, document everything exactly as I'd found it, because whatever had happened here, whatever Blackwood really was, these 19 men were part of it. And if their belongings were buried under the floorboards, I was pretty sure they weren't coming back to collect them. I drove back to the station that afternoon with 13 wallets and a bunch of personal stuff sitting in evidence bags on my passenger seat. Couldn't stop thinking about those names, 19 men who just disappeared from the records. Tony wasn't in his office when I got back, so I dumped everything on my desk and fired up the computer. I needed to figure out who these guys were. The ranger station keeps newspaper archives on microfiche going back to the 50s. Most of it's local stuff, the Mountain View Herald, some regional papers. I figured if 19 loggers went missing from a work camp, somebody would have written about it. I started with 1963. That's when the earliest driver's license expired. Took me about an hour to find the first article. Small thing, buried on page 4 of the Herald from September 1963. Local man missing from logging camp. Robert Kellerman, same guy whose wallet I'd pulled out of that crawl space. The article said he'd been working at Blackwood for 2 months when he failed to return home to his family in Millfield. His wife contacted the sheriff's department after a week. The logging company told police Kellerman had quit without notice and taken his belongings. Standard stuff, apparently. But I had his wallet and his wedding ring. I kept digging. Found another one from November 1963. James Cordell, this time. Same story. Family filed a missing person report. Company said he quit and left. Then Thomas Wright in February 1964. Michael Santos that summer. Every single article said the same thing. Company claimed the men quit without notice and took their stuff with them. Families insisted their guys would never just disappear like that. Police investigated but never found anything. I printed everything I could find. By the time I was done, I had 17 articles spanning from 1963 to 1967. 17 missing loggers. The other 2 names from the wallets didn't turn up in the papers, but that didn't mean they weren't reported. Small town papers don't catch everything. The pattern was pretty clear. Guys would work at Blackwood for a few weeks or months, then vanish. Company always said they quit. Families always said that was impossible. Police always came up empty. What really got me was the timeline. The disappearances stopped completely after 1967, not gradually, just stopped, like someone flipped a switch. I was about to start looking for 1968 articles when I found something that made me sit back in my chair. March 15th, 1968. Front page of the Herald. Logging foreman dies in highway accident. Taylor Gregory, Blackwood's foreman since 1962. The article said he'd been driving north toward the Canadian border when he lost control on Highway 101 and hit a tree. Died instantly. But here's the thing, he wasn't supposed to be driving to Canada. According to the article, police had been looking for Gregory for 3 days. Seems they'd discovered some financial irregularities in Blackwood's books, missing payroll funds, timber sales that didn't add up. Gregory had cleaned out the company accounts and disappeared. They found evidence he'd been skimming worker paychecks and falsifying timber sale records for years. The accident happened while he was fleeing. I read that article 3 times. Then I started looking for more. Found a follow-up piece from March 22nd. Blackwood logging operations cease. Company went under after Gregory's death. No money left to pay outstanding contracts. Workers got laid off. Camp was abandoned. The whole operation just collapsed overnight. I leaned back and stared at the stack of printouts. So Gregory had been stealing from his own workers. That explained some things, but it didn't explain why 19 men's personal belongings were buried under a bunkhouse floor. If Gregory was just embezzling paychecks, why hide wallets and wedding rings? Why not just pocket the cash and let the workers quit when they stopped getting paid, unless they didn't quit? I thought about those work boots lined up under the floorboards, 13 pairs in different sizes. Some barely worn, others scuffed up from months of use. People don't abandon good work boots, especially loggers making barely enough to get by. And the wedding rings, found 7 of them. Men don't forget their wedding rings when they pack up and leave. They just don't. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like those belongings weren't hidden. They were buried, like evidence. Like something Gregory needed to make disappear along with the men who owned them. But that was a hell of an accusation to make based on some old newspaper articles and a bunch of stuff under some floorboards. I needed more. Something concrete. I started looking for police reports from that period. Missing person files. Anything official that might connect the dots between the newspaper articles and what I'd found at the camp. That's when Tony walked in. "Working late?" he asked, glancing at the stack of printouts on my desk. "Research," I said. "Found some interesting stuff about Blackwood." I told him about the newspaper articles, the missing loggers, Gregory's embezzlement, and the car accident. Tony listened without saying much, but I could see him getting more interested as I talked. "So you think this Gregory guy was killing his own workers?" he asked when I finished. "I think something was happening to those men besides quitting without notice," I said. 19 guys don't just vanish and leave their wallets behind. Tony picked up one of the articles and skimmed it. "This is from 1963. That's 60 years ago." "Yeah, but those belongings I found were preserved pretty well. Dry crawl space, protected from the elements. And the pattern fits. Disappearances stop right when Gregory dies in 1968. "What about the recent disappearances? The 7 hikers?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. "I don't know. Could be unrelated. Could be something else entirely." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. 7 people don't vanish from the same location where 19 others disappeared decades earlier just by coincidence. Tony set the article down. "Keep digging," he said. "But be careful about jumping to conclusions. We need facts, not theories." After he left, I sat there looking at everything I'd printed. The newspaper articles told a story, but not the whole story. Gregory was a thief. That much was clear. But was he also a killer? And if he was, what did that mean for the 7 missing hikers? I packed up the printouts and locked the evidence bags in my desk drawer. Tomorrow I'd start looking for police files from the 60s. Maybe track down some family members of the missing loggers, if any were still alive. The pieces were starting to come together, but I had a feeling the picture they'd form wasn't going to be pretty. I drove back to Blackwood that evening with my truck loaded down like I was heading out for a week-long backcountry assignment. Camping gear, extra batteries, more evidence bags than I'd probably need. The whole drive up those winding forest roads, I kept thinking about those 19 wallets. 19 guys who just vanished. Tony had said, "Keep digging," so that's what I was going to do. I figured 3 days would be enough to really tear that place apart. Document everything properly. Maybe find something that would connect Gregory's missing loggers to the 7 hikers. Had to be connected somehow. Same place, people disappearing without a trace. That's not coincidence. The sun was getting low when I pulled into the parking area. Long shadows stretched across the dirt from the pine trees. I grabbed my pack and tent from the truck bed and hiked back through that broken gate, following the old road in the dim light. The forest felt even quieter than before. Not even birds. Took me about 30 minutes to reach the clearing this time. I knew the route now. I set up my tent on the far side of the mess hall, away from the bunkhouse where I'd been working. Figured I didn't want to sleep right next to whatever else might be buried under those floorboards. The ground was level there, and mostly clear of debris. Good spot to keep an eye on the whole camp. Got my camp stove going and heated up some chili from a can while the light faded. Sitting there eating and looking at those old buildings in the twilight, I kept thinking about Gregory. Guy embezzled money for 6 years while men disappeared, then dies in a car wreck trying to flee to Canada. That timing bothered me, like maybe he wasn't just running from financial crimes. I finished eating and cleaned up my gear. Still had maybe an hour of decent light left. Time to get back to work. I grabbed my LED lantern and headed to the bunkhouse. The floorboards I'd pulled up that morning were still stacked against the wall where I'd left them. The hole gaped open like a mouth. That musty smell drifted up from the crawl space. I'd only searched about half the area under there. Time to see what else Gregory had buried. I lowered the lantern into the hole and crawled in on my hands and knees. The space was cramped, maybe 4 feet high, but it extended further back than I'd realized. My light beam picked up more scattered items in the dirt. I started working systematically, moving from left to right, documenting everything with my camera before I touched it. Found 3 more wallets right away. 2 were leather, cracked with age. 1 was canvas, military style. I photographed them in place, then carefully lifted each one out of the dirt. The canvas wallet had an ID for Stephen Rodriguez, expired 1964. 1 leather wallet belonged to Frank Morrison, expired 1966. The other was so deteriorated I couldn't make out the name on the license. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was finding work gloves, 7 pairs of them, scattered through the dirt, like they'd been tossed in randomly. Heavy canvas gloves, the kind loggers used back then. Some still had the price tags attached. 59 cents at Morrison Hardware. These weren't worn-out gloves someone threw away. They were practically new. Who buries new work gloves? I kept digging, found a pocket watch with a broken chain. The back was engraved, "To Henry from Dad, Christmas 1962. Found a St. Christopher medal on a silver chain. Found a bent pair of wire-rimmed glasses. Each item I pulled out of that dirt felt heavier than it should. These were things people carried every day, things that mattered to them. You don't just lose a St. Christopher medal or forget your prescription glasses when you quit a job. I'd been working for about 40 minutes when I hit something hard with my trowel. At first I thought it was a rock. The dirt here was looser, like it had been disturbed more recently than the rest. I brushed away the soil carefully, using my fingers to feel around the edges of whatever I'd found. Not a rock. I knew what it was before I fully uncovered it. The shape was unmistakable, round, about the size of a softball, smooth in some places with distinct ridges and cavities, a human skull. My stomach dropped like I'd missed a step going downstairs. I sat back on my heels and stared at the thing. The empty eye socket stared back. Most of the jawbone was missing, probably somewhere else in the dirt, but the top of the skull was intact. There was a crack running along the left side, dark with age. I'd found plenty of human remains during my search and rescue days in Colorado, hikers who'd fallen, climbers who'd gotten caught in avalanches, but those were accidents, natural deaths. This felt different. This skull was buried under floorboards in a hidden crawl space, along with 19 men's personal belongings. This wasn't an accident. I pulled out my camera and started documenting, photos from every angle, with the ruler for scale. The skull was partially embedded in the dirt, positioned face up like someone had just dropped it there. I didn't move it. That was a job for the coroner's office and the state police. But I needed to call this in right away. I crawled out of the hole and grabbed my radio from my pack. The Park Service radio was supposed to have a range of about 15 miles in good conditions. Should be enough to reach the station from here. "Base, this is Ford. Come in, base." Nothing but static. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. "Base, this is Ford at Blackwood. Emergency traffic. Come in." More static. Maybe a voice buried way down in the noise, but I couldn't make it out. I walked around the clearing, holding the radio up high, trying to find a signal. The mountains probably blocked transmission in most directions, and with the sun down, atmospheric conditions weren't helping. "Base, base. This is Ford. I need immediate assistance at Blackwood. Please respond." Dead air. I was on my own until morning. I went back to the bunkhouse and carefully marked the skull's location with bright orange flagging tape tied to a wooden stake I hammered into the ground next to the hole. GPS coordinates went into my notebook: 45 degrees, 37 minutes, 12 seconds north, 121 degrees, 44 minutes, 38 seconds west. Depth, approximately 18 inches below floor level. Then I kept digging. If there was one skull, there might be more. And if I was going to spend the night here anyway, might as well document everything I could find before I drove out in the morning to report this mess. The dirt around the skull was softer than the rest of the crawl space, like it had been dug up and refilled multiple times. I worked carefully, brushing soil away with my fingers and a small brush from my evidence kit. Found part of a rib cage about 2 feet to the right of the skull. Then, what looked like finger bones scattered in a rough circle around where the torso would have been. This guy had been dismembered before burial, chopped up and buried in pieces. I photographed everything exactly where I found it, took measurements, made detailed notes in my waterproof notebook. By the time I finished documenting that first set of remains, it was past midnight, but I wasn't tired. My mind was racing too fast for sleep. I crawled back into the hole and kept searching, found more bones scattered through the dirt, pieces from different people, mixed together like Gregory had just dumped bodies in here over time without much organization. A jawbone here, part of a leg bone there. I counted what looked like pieces from at least 3 different skulls in various stages of preservation. 3 skulls meant at least 3 dead loggers. Probably more. Gregory hadn't just been embezzling money. He'd been murdering his workers and burying the evidence under the bunkhouse floor. The radio crackled with static every time I tried to raise the station. The mountains blocked everything. I was completely cut off from the outside world, sitting in a logging camp where a serial killer had operated for 6 years back in the 60s. But I wasn't leaving, not yet. I had evidence of multiple homicides here. Evidence that could finally explain what happened to those 19 missing loggers. Evidence that might somehow connect to the 7 missing hikers, though I still didn't understand that part. I needed to document everything thoroughly before I drove out in the morning. Take photos, measurements, detailed notes. Map the location of every bone fragment and personal item. Do this right, because once the state police took over this scene, my chance to understand what really happened at Blackwood would be gone. I set up my work light on a tripod and kept digging. I was still crouched in that crawl space around midnight when I heard the first set of footsteps. Heavy boots on packed dirt, steady rhythm, like someone walking a patrol route. My flashlight beam froze on a finger bone I'd been photographing. The footsteps circled my tent once, twice. Stopped right outside the mess hall where I was working. I clicked off the light and listened. Nothing but my own breathing and the sound of my heart doing double time. The footsteps started again. Different pattern this time. More of them, like 3 or 4 guys walking around the clearing, talking low enough that I couldn't make out words. Just the rise and fall of conversation drifting through the broken windows. I figured it was other investigators. Maybe state police had gotten word about the bones somehow. Though that didn't make much sense since my radio hadn't worked all day. I crawled out of the hole and stood up slow. My knees cracked loud enough to wake the dead, which probably wasn't the best phrase to use right then. The voices got clearer as I moved toward the front door. Definitely men talking. Something about timber counts and payroll. One guy complaining about the foreman being a bastard. Another one laughing and saying Gregory could kiss his ass. Gregory. That name made my stomach drop. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. The voices stopped the second my boots hit the porch. Complete silence. Not even crickets. I swept the beam across the clearing. My tent sat there looking normal. The other buildings were dark and empty like they'd been all day. No footprints in the dirt except mine from earlier. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone there?" My voice echoed off the trees and died. The silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I walked over to my tent and checked inside. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. Sleeping bag still rolled up. Camp stove sitting on the folding table, nothing disturbed, but the voices had been real. I'd heard them clear as anything. I decided to check the mess hall since that's where most of the talking seemed to come from. The front door was still propped open from when I'd wedged it with a rock that morning. I stepped inside and immediately felt the temperature drop about 10 degrees. Made no sense. There weren't any drafts in the building. All the windows were intact and the walls were solid. I moved deeper into the room, flashlight beam dancing across overturned tables and chairs. The cold got worse as I walked toward the back corner, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. My breath started fogging up. In July, in Oregon. I stopped next to what used to be the serving counter and just stood there for a minute. The cold was coming from right above my head, but when I pointed the flashlight up, I didn't see anything except old ceiling beams. That's when my radio started acting up. It was clipped to my belt, turned off like it had been all day since the static was driving me crazy, but now it was crackling to life on its own. Static at first, then voices cutting through the white noise. "Tommy, get over here. Foreman wants to see you after..." "Don't tell him about the transmission cut out. More static. Then a voice that made my blood freeze. "Please. I got a wife, kids. I'll keep quiet. I swear I'll..." Static swallowed the rest. I yanked the radio off my belt and stared at it. The power button was definitely in the off position, but the green LED was blinking and voices kept bleeding through. Rodriguez didn't come back from... Found his lunch pail by the river, but... Gregory's lying. He wouldn't just leave without... I turned the volume all the way down. The voices got quieter, but didn't stop completely. This was when I started thinking about the 7 missing hikers. Marcus Chen with his 20 years of experience. The Hendricks couple who left their campsite with everything still in it. Those 4 college kids who just vanished. What if they'd heard the same things I was hearing? What if they'd gone looking for the source of those voices and never came back? I needed to search the woods around the camp, not tomorrow morning, right now. I went back to my tent and grabbed my backup flashlight, extra batteries, and evidence bags. If there were more graves out there, I was going to find them before whatever was making those voices decided to pay me a closer visit. The tree line started about 50 yards from the clearing. I picked the area behind the mess hall since that's where the voices seemed strongest. I moved slow, sweeping the flashlight beam back and forth across the ground, looking for anything that didn't belong. Disturbed earth, scattered belongings, more of those orange surveyor flags that marked God knows what. About 100 yards into the trees, I found the first one. A slight depression in the earth, maybe 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Covered with pine needles, but you could still see where someone had dug and filled it back in. The dirt was darker than the surrounding soil and settled lower. I cleared away the needles and started digging with the folding shovel from my pack. 18 inches down, my blade hit fabric. A flannel shirt. Still had most of its color, despite being underground for 60 years. I brushed away more dirt and found work pants, a leather belt with a brass buckle. No body inside the clothes. Just fabric and buttons and a pair of rotted work boots. But tucked in the shirt pocket was a wallet. Brown leather, cracked but intact. Inside was a driver's license for Martin Kowalski, expired 1965. I bagged everything and marked the spot with orange flagging tape. Then I kept searching. The second grave was about 50 yards north, closer to what used to be the main logging road. Same size depression. Same dark, settled earth. This time I found a canvas jacket and denim overalls, work gloves still tucked in the jacket pockets, and another wallet belonging to Carl Henderson, expired 1966. Both names were on my list of missing loggers from the newspaper articles. I sat back on my heels and looked at the evidence bags scattered around me. 21 wallets now, 21 men who came to work at Blackwood and never went home. The pattern was clear. Gregory wasn't just embezzling payroll funds. He was killing workers and keeping their paychecks for himself. Probably told their families the guys had quit and moved on. Told the company the same thing. Perfect setup. Logging camps had high turnover anyway. Guys drifted from job to job. Didn't always keep in touch with family. Gregory could make someone disappear and nobody would ask too many questions. For 6 years, he'd been running his own little murder operation out here. Killing workers, burying their bodies, keeping their pay. That's how he funded his embezzlement scheme. Dead men don't collect paychecks. My radio crackled again. A voice came through clear as day. Gregory's coming. Hide the... The transmission cut to static, then silence. I looked back toward the camp buildings, their dark shapes barely visible through the trees. 21 men had died here because of one bastard's greed. And now, 7 hikers had vanished from the same place. The cold got worse after midnight. I'm talking about serious cold, like someone opened a freezer door in the middle of July. I sat by my tent with the camp stove still running, trying to stay warm, when the temperature dropped another 10 degrees in about 30 seconds. That's when I started seeing them. At first I figured it was just shadows from my work light. You know how your eyes play tricks when you're tired and stressed out. But these weren't shadows. These were people. Translucent guys in work clothes walking between the buildings like they had somewhere to be. I could see right through them to the trees behind, but they were definitely there, moving with purpose. One carried a double-bit axe over his shoulder. Another had a crosscut saw, the kind that takes 2 men to operate. They wore the same canvas pants and flannel shirts I'd been finding buried in the dirt all night. I sat real still and watched. Didn't want to spook them, if that was even possible with ghosts. Probably sounds crazy, but after everything I'd dug up, seeing dead loggers walking around didn't seem that far-fetched. They moved like they were looking for something, checking the bunkhouses, circling the mess hall, stopping to peer into windows. Confused, maybe. Lost. One guy kept walking the same route over and over, from the first bunkhouse to the mess hall, then back again. Like he was trying to remember something important, but couldn't quite get there. The temperature kept dropping. My breath started fogging, even with the camp stove running full blast. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept watching. That's when one of them broke off from the group and started walking toward me. Young guy, maybe 25. Flannel shirt, suspenders, work boots that looked practically new. He got about 10 feet from my camp stove and stopped. Just stood there looking at me with these hollow eyes that weren't really eyes at all. Then I saw the gash. Deep cut across his throat, ear to ear. Dark line that went all the way through. I'd seen enough crime scenes to know what that meant. Someone had taken their time with this one, made sure he couldn't call for help. He raised his arm and pointed. Not at me, but past me, toward the far side of the clearing. I turned to look and saw the foreman's office, smaller building I hadn't checked yet. When I looked back, he was still pointing. Urgent, like he was trying to tell me something important. "The office," I said out loud. Felt stupid talking to a ghost, but there it was. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then he pointed again, more insistent this time. I got the message. The other figures had stopped their wandering and were all looking at me now. 6 or 7 of them spread across the clearing, all pointing toward the foreman's office, all with the same desperate look, like they'd been waiting 60 years for someone to understand what they were trying to say. I figured they'd earned the right to be heard. I grabbed my flashlight and evidence bags and walked across the clearing. The temperature warmed up as I got further from the mess hall, but not by much. Still cold enough to see my breath. The foreman's office was smaller than the other buildings, maybe 20 by 15 feet, single story with a covered porch and 2 front windows. The door was unlocked, same as everything else. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The place was remarkably well preserved. Better than it had any right to be after 60 years of abandonment, like someone had been taking care of it. Or maybe time just moved differently here. There was a wooden desk against the far wall, big oak thing that probably weighed 300 pounds, a couple filing cabinets, some metal chairs, and shelves lined with ledgers and papers, everything covered in dust but not rotted like I expected. I swept my flashlight around the room and noticed something weird. The desk looked different from the rest of the furniture. Cleaner, less dust, like someone had been using it recently. I walked over and tried the drawers. Top one was stuck, but the second one slid open easy. Full of pencils, paper clips, the usual office stuff from the 60s. Nothing interesting. Third drawer had some old invoices and timber contracts. Standard logging business. The bottom drawer was locked. I tried to slide it open, but it wouldn't budge. Heavy lock, built into the drawer mechanism. The kind you don't break without serious tools. But I noticed the wood around the lock was warped, like moisture had gotten in and loosened things up. I worked my knife blade into the gap between the drawer and frame, wiggling it back and forth until I felt something give. The lock mechanism was old and the wood was soft. After a few minutes of careful prying, the drawer popped open. Inside was a single ledger. Leather-bound book, maybe 8 by 10 inches. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and there was a name embossed in gold letters that had mostly faded away. I could just make out T. Gregory in fancy script. I lifted it out and set it on the desk. The pages were yellow with age, but perfectly readable. Dense handwriting in black ink, neat columns of numbers and dates. At first it looked like standard bookkeeping. Payroll records, maybe. Then I started reading the entries. The first page was dated March 15th, 1963. 3 columns: name, date, and amount. Under name was R. Kellerman. Under date was March 12th, 1963. Under amount was $47. Robert Kellerman. The first wallet I'd found. I flipped to the next entry. J. Cordell, November 8th, 1963. $52. James Cordell. Second wallet. My blood started running cold as I kept reading. Every name matched a wallet I'd found. Every date was within a few days of when the newspaper articles said they'd gone missing. And the amounts, those were their final paychecks. Money Gregory had kept for himself. But there was more. A fourth column I hadn't noticed at first, labeled Method. And what I read there made my stomach turn. Axe to skull during tree felling, staged as accident. Throat cut during night watch, body buried in woods. Crushed by falling timber, witnesses eliminated. This wasn't just a record of stolen wages, it was Gregory's personal murder log. 12 entries total, spanning from 1963 to 1967. 12 men killed for questioning missing paychecks or threatening to report safety violations to the state. I sat in that dusty chair reading page after page of calculated brutality. Gregory had documented everything. How he'd isolated each victim. How he'd made their deaths look accidental. How he'd disposed of the bodies and covered his tracks. Even notes about which stories to tell their families. One entry stopped me cold. M. Santos questioned payroll discrepancies during crew meeting, eliminated via staged equipment failure, told crew he quit and moved to California, wife believes story. Michael Santos. Found his wallet yesterday morning. Guy had a wife who spent 60 years thinking her husband abandoned her, when really he'd been murdered for asking why his paycheck was short. The last entry was dated October 23, 1967. C. Henderson reported safety violations to state inspector. Throat cut during hunting trip. Body weighted and sunk in quarry pond. Told crew he found work in Portland. Carl Henderson. Dug up his grave just a few hours ago. I closed the ledger and sat back in the chair. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. Gregory hadn't just been embezzling money, he'd been running a systematic murder operation, killing anyone who got too close to figuring out his scheme. 12 men over 4 years. Probably more that weren't in the book. And now 7 hikers had vanished from the same place. I looked around the office and saw the translucent figures standing in the doorway, still pointing, still trying to communicate after all these years. Now I understood what they wanted: justice, recognition, someone to finally know what really happened to them. I pulled out my phone and started copying everything from that ledger. Every name, every date, every amount Gregory stole, every method he used to kill them. My hands were shaking a little, but I kept writing. These weren't just random murders. These guys had been trying to protect their crew. M. Santos questioned payroll discrepancies. That's what got him killed. C. Henderson reported safety violations. Dead for doing the right thing. 3 different entries mentioned workers who asked too many questions about missing wages. Gregory eliminated them because they were standing up for their fellow loggers. I figured out his whole system while I copied those pages. Guy would wait for someone to complain about safety or missing pay. Then he'd create an opportunity. Axe to skull during tree felling. Crushed by falling timber. Witnesses eliminated. That last part made my stomach turn. Sometimes he had to kill more than one person to cover his tracks. The ledger had 12 entries total. 12 murders spanning 4 years. Each one documented like a business transaction. Amount stolen ranged from $68 to $132. Gregory was killing people for less than most folks spend on groceries now. I finished copying the last entry and closed the ledger. My phone battery was getting low, but I had everything recorded. These men deserved better than being Gregory's secret. They died trying to protect each other, and nobody even knew their names were missing from the company records. That's when I stepped outside. The translucent figures had gathered in the clearing, all of them. Must have been 20 or more ghostly loggers standing in a loose circle around my tent. They weren't moving anymore, just watching me with these desperate expressions that made my chest tight. I could see right through them, but their faces were clear enough. Young guys, mostly. Work clothes torn and bloody where Gregory had killed them. The one with the throat wound stood closest to me, still pointing toward the office, but his expression had changed, less frantic, more hopeful. "I know what happened to you," I said out loud. Felt weird talking to empty air, but these weren't empty air anymore. "I found Gregory's records. I know he murdered all of you." The figures didn't move, but something shifted in the clearing, like they were listening. "Your bodies are going to get proper burial," I continued. "Your families are going to learn the truth. I'm not leaving here until every one of you gets justice." That was it. The moment I made that promise, everything changed. The oppressive feeling that had been pressing down on the camp since I'd arrived just lifted, like someone had opened all the windows in a stuffy room. The temperature went back to normal July night warmth. Even the silence felt different. Natural forest quiet instead of that held breath feeling. The ghostly figures were still there, but they looked peaceful now. A few of them nodded at me. The young one with the throat wound actually smiled. Then they started fading. Not disappearing fast, just slowly becoming less solid until they were gone. I stood in the clearing, holding my phone with Gregory's murder confession copied into it. The camp felt empty now. Really empty. Not haunted anymore. But I wasn't done. I grabbed my LED lantern and folding shovel and started walking the perimeter of the clearing. Gregory's ledger had location details for each burial. 50 yards northwest of Mess Hall behind Large Pine. Eastern tree line, past Boulder Formation. Guy was methodical even about hiding bodies. First grave I found matched the ledger exactly. 100 yards east of the foreman's office, just past where the old logging road curved. Darker earth in a 6-foot rectangle, settled lower than the surrounding ground. I stuck an orange flag in the dirt and wrote, "Grave 1 R. Kellerman," on the flag with my Sharpie. Took me 20 minutes to locate the second burial site. Gregory's notes said, "Northern perimeter, twin oak trees." Found the twin oaks, easy enough. The grave was between them, covered with decades of pine needles but still showing the depression. I worked through the night like that, cross-referencing Gregory's notes with the terrain. Some graves were easier to spot than others. A few had settled so much they were just shallow dips in the forest floor. But every location in the ledger was accurate. By 4 in the morning, I'd found 10 burial sites. 2 more took another hour because Gregory's handwriting got sloppy toward the end of the ledger. West of camp, near Fallen Log, could have been anywhere, but I found them both eventually. Marked every single grave with orange flagging tape and clear labels. 12 graves total. 12 men who'd died trying to do right by their crews. The sun started coming up around 5:30. I was exhausted, but I walked the entire perimeter one more time, checking my flags and making sure I hadn't missed anything. All 12 burial sites were clearly marked and GPS coordinates recorded in my phone. I sat on the mess hall steps as full daylight hit the clearing. My radio had been quiet for hours. No more phantom voices bleeding through the static. No more footsteps circling the buildings. No more temperature drops or mysterious sounds. The supernatural phenomena had stopped completely the moment I'd promised those men justice, like they'd been waiting 60 years for someone to find Gregory's confession and commit to telling the truth. Now they could rest. 21 dead loggers finally had someone who knew their names and how they'd died. 7 missing hikers still needed answers, but at least the historical murders wouldn't stay buried anymore. I packed up my camping gear and loaded everything in the truck. Drove out of Blackwood knowing I'd be back with state police and crime scene investigators. Those 12 graves would be excavated properly. Those men would get real burials with their families present. The spirits had found peace once they knew justice was coming. The state police showed up 3 days later with a full crime scene team. Detective Sarah Martinez ran the excavation. She was maybe 45, gray streaks in her black hair, and she'd worked missing persons for 15 years. First thing she said when we met at the camp was, "You found more bodies in one night than I've recovered in the last 5 years." I walked her through every grave I'd marked with orange tape, showed her Gregory's ledger entries, explained how the names matched the wallets and newspaper articles. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in a little spiral pad. "This is going to take weeks," she said, looking at the 12 flagged locations scattered through the woods. "Maybe months." She was right. The excavation lasted almost 6 weeks. I went back every few days to help with identification since I'd cataloged all the personal belongings. They brought in forensic anthropologists from the state university, set up a processing tent in the clearing, turned the whole camp into a proper crime scene. The first complete remains they recovered belonged to Robert Kellerman, found his body 30 feet from where I dug up his wallet. The skull had that same dark crack I'd seen in the crawl space, but this one still had the jawbone attached. Axe wound, just like Gregory wrote in his ledger. Staged as accident during tree felling. They found Martin Kowalski 2 weeks later. His remains were in better condition, probably because of where Gregory buried him. Drier soil. The forensic guy said the throat wound was clean, single cut. Gregory knew what he was doing. Each recovery felt like something lifting. Hard to explain, like the camp was getting lighter as they pulled each body from the ground. The temperature stayed normal. No more phantom radio transmissions, just regular forest sounds during the day and normal quiet at night. Martinez called me every time they made an identification. "Got another one for you, Ford. Carl Henderson. Matches the wallet you found." Her voice always had this satisfied edge, like she was checking names off a long list. The families started showing up by the 3rd week, sons and daughters who'd been kids when their fathers disappeared. A few widows still alive after 60 years. Martinez set up meetings at the station, away from the excavation site. Didn't want them seeing the recovery process. Mrs. Santos came from California. She was 91, used a walker, but she wanted to see where they found Miguel. Her daughter drove her up from Sacramento. "I always knew he didn't just leave," she said, sitting in Tony's office with tears running down her cheeks. "Miguel would never leave without saying goodbye." That conversation stuck with me. 60 years she'd been wondering. 60 years of not knowing if her husband abandoned his family or something happened to him. Gregory's lies had kept her guessing until she was too old to care about anything except the truth. The missing hikers' stuff turned up during the 4th week of excavation. They were processing the area around the mess hall when Martinez called me. "You need to see this, Ford." I drove out that afternoon. She led me to a spot 20 yards behind the building where they'd been working through loose soil with hand tools, 7 backpacks arranged in a neat row. All the gear still inside. Water bottles, sleeping bags, camp stoves, food. Everything you'd pack for a backcountry trip. "Marcus Chen's pack," Martinez said, pointing to the first one. "Sarah and Jim Hendricks, the 4 college students. All here." I crouched down next to Chen's pack. North Face, blue and gray, probably cost $300. His wallet was still in the front pocket. Driver's license, credit cards, $47 cash. Nobody leaves their wallet behind when they're hiking. "Any bodies?" I asked. Martinez shook her head. "Just the gear, like they dropped everything and walked away." That bugged me. Gregory's victims were all accounted for in his ledger. 12 entries, 12 burial sites, 12 recovered bodies. But 7 hikers had vanished from the same location without a trace. Their gear buried like evidence, but no remains anywhere on the property. I helped Martinez bag the hiking equipment. Each pack got photographed and cataloged before going into evidence storage. Families would get the personal items back eventually, but the investigation had to run its course first. Writing the official report took me 2 weeks. 47 pages documenting everything from the hidden room in the bunkhouse to Gregory's confession ledger. I included photos of every burial site, GPS coordinates, victim identifications, and the complete timeline of disappearances from 1963 to 1967. The hardest part was explaining how I'd found everything, had to stick to facts, couldn't mention phantom voices or translucent figures pointing toward the foreman's office. Wrote it up as methodical investigation based on physical evidence and historical research. Which was true enough. Detective Martinez reviewed my report before submission. "This is solid work, Ford. Gives us everything we need for the families." The district attorney decided against pursuing charges, obviously. Gregory died in 1968. Case closed by statute of limitations and the suspect being 60 years dead. But the families got answers. That mattered more than legal proceedings. They held a memorial service in October. The state approved a granite marker for the clearing where the bunkhouses stood. Simple inscription: "In memory of the 12 men who died at this location, 1963, 1967. Listed every name from Gregory's ledger. I stood with maybe 40 people during the dedication ceremony. Families, state officials, local residents who remembered the original disappearances. Martinez gave a short speech about justice delayed but not denied. A minister said a prayer. Mrs. Santos placed flowers at the base of the memorial, white roses. Her daughter helped her walk back to the car afterward, but she stopped and looked at me. "Thank you for finding him," she said. "Now I can stop wondering." That was it. Simple words, but they meant something. The ceremony lasted maybe 30 minutes. People talked quietly afterward, sharing stories about the men who'd died. Then everyone drove away, and the clearing was empty again, except for the granite memorial standing where Gregory's bunkhouses used to be. I'd come out to document trails for closure. Instead, I'd uncovered 12 murders and solved disappearances that had haunted families for 6 decades. Wasn't what I expected when Tony handed me that assignment back in July. The strangest part happened over the following months. I kept working the same territory, covering trail maintenance and incident reports throughout the district. Spent plenty of nights camping in remote areas where I'd experienced weird phenomena before. Temperature drops, unexplained sounds, equipment malfunctions. None of that happened anymore. I'd been a ranger for 3 years, search and rescue for 5 before that. Used to dealing with the forest feeling off sometimes, places where your radio wouldn't work right or you'd hear voices when nobody was around. Part of the job in isolated wilderness areas. But after the memorial went up, everything stayed normal. Regular forest quiet, equipment worked properly, no phantom transmissions or cold spots or feeling like something was watching from the trees. Took me a while to connect it. The spirits I'd encountered at Blackwood weren't random haunting. They had a purpose. Needed someone to find the truth about what Gregory had done. Needed justice for themselves and answers for their families. I'd given them what they wanted. Proper burial, recognition, the truth finally documented in official records. Gregory's crimes exposed after 60 years of being hidden under floorboards and buried in unmarked graves. They could rest now. Whatever kept them tied to that place was finished. The 7 missing hikers were still unexplained, their belongings recovered, but their fate unknown. That investigation stayed open with the state police. But the murdered loggers from the 60s had found their peace through my work at Blackwood Camp. 60 years they'd been waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find Gregory's confession. Someone willing to spend the night and listen when the guy tried to point toward the truth.